Today we're going to be now having a panel discussion on bodily autonomy. Our moderator was going to be Ruth Baldacchino. I wanted to mention that because Ruth is very sorry they can't be here and was a really important member of our International Advisory Board for the conference. A non-binary activist, a former co-secretary general of ILGA World. Ruth is a true giant of our movement and we pay our respects to Ruth. As our panel begins to walk onto the stage, I just wanted to give a brief introduction to this topic, which is that violations of bodily autonomy do occur in a range of settings and contexts. They include barriers to accessing healthcare, forced medical treatment and sterilisation, and unequal access to sexual and reproductive services and healthcare. Around the world, women, LGBTIQ+ people, and people with disabilities are particularly vulnerable to violations of their human right to bodily autonomy or integrity. For intersex and trans and gender diverse people, this risk is particularly pronounced due to the stigmatisation of people and bodies that do not conform to social and medical norms. That's why today we have 4 brilliant activists that I'm delighted to introduce to you now to take forward this discussion. We have, starting with Zhan. Zhan is the outgoing Deputy Director of Transgender Europe, but is Singaporean Australian, worth noting for the audience here at home, and has been working on trans rights for a number of years, particularly research, but also advocacy at the UN and around the world. Thank you, Zhan. Julia Ehrt is probably known to many of you in the room. She is our ruler. She is an activist, community leader, and the executive director of ILGA World. ILGA World, for people that don't know, is a federation of more than 1,700 LGBTIQ+ human rights organisations around the world from 160 countries and territories. Thank you, Julia, for joining us. We then have Morgan Carpenter. Morgan is a bioethicist and the Executive Director of Intersex Human Rights Australia, a national organisation working towards the human rights and health of all intersex people in Australia, but is also a published author and works internationally on intersex human rights advocacy. Welcome, Morgan.
Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, the wonderful Hendricks. Crystal is another leading intersex activist and is the Intersex Rights Officer at Iranti, a media advocacy organisation defending the rights of LGBTI+ people with a specific focus on lesbian, intersex, trans and gender non-conforming people in Africa. Crystal's also the chair of the Intersex Committee for ILGA World, so works internationally as well. And I heard this morning is a rising TikTok star, so make sure you check her out on TikTok. Now we're going to start with Morgan and Crystal. For those that don't know, what does it mean to be intersex? And what are the particular challenges faced by intersex people when it comes to bodily autonomy?
Thank you, Anna. I think Steph has already talked quite vividly about some of the experiences that people with intersex variations can face. So intersex is one of a couple of different terms, or a few different terms, for people with innate variations of sex characteristics, bodies that don't fit normative medical and social ideas of what it means to be female or male. And there are at least 40 very different traits with people have different kinds of experiences. Each of those traits has a name, and we know that there are different ages of disclosure or diagnosis and different ways in which people are treated in terms of sex assignment, medical interventions, and legal status as well. And some of the particular challenges that are shared across the population are experiences or risks of stigmatization and harm because of the ways that our bodies are perceived as different. And from age of diagnosis, whether that's prenatally, at birth or early childhood, or during childhood or adolescence, or even later, that can mean risks of medical interventions aimed at making our bodies fit ideas about how girls and boys, women or men, should appear and function. And I think it's important for me to say that the population is incredibly diverse in terms of the language that people use. People might only have access to a diagnostic label. They might use the word intersex. They might use clinical language of disorders of sex development or differences of sex development. And the population is incredibly diverse when it comes to identity as well. So we don't know the sexual orientation or gender identity of infants and young children, and they may grow up to have an LGBT, LGBTQ identity, or they might not. And that diversity is really crucial when we think about bodily autonomy, because each individual will have their own values and preferences about how they want to be treated. And the work of the intersex movement is trying to make sure that everybody has the maximum potential to express our own views about how we should be treated.
Thanks, Morgan. And Crystal, what's your perspective here? And I should have also mentioned, I mean, I know there's a content warning for the entire conference, but this discussion will raise some distressing topics, including torture, murder, hate, and of course, medical and physical violence. So just wanted to let the audience know that as well. Crystal, love to hear from you as well on your reflections on the challenges for intersex people when it comes to bodily autonomy.
Yeah, thank you. And again, good morning, everyone. Yeah, like Morgan has described what are intersex, and like we all know, some intersex traits are visible at birth and some are not visible at birth. Some people only find out they are intersex much later in life, and even if you do get a medical diagnosis, oftentimes doctors are not honest to you or to your parents about your variation, right? They call it a disorder. They do what they have to as for what they think is best for you, and then they send you home. So oftentimes intersex people are stripped of like the thing that's most important to all of us, which is our body, right? Our bodily autonomy, us making decisions for our bodies, making decisions based on our own self-determination and what is good for us. As intersex people, from the moment you are born and you have visible sex traits that this is an intersex person, a decision gets made for that child there and then. And this decision is not based off of health reasons, because the child's life is at risk. It's based on binary notions and cosmetic procedures, right? So these surgeries are cosmetic in a way that doctors will decide that if this is a girl, we need to perform surgery to give her what looks like to be a vagina. Like they decide, right, what is perfect and how bodies should look like, and therefore doctors make these decisions. And as the intersex community or as intersex people, we have seen that there's no evidence that these surgeries are actually anything good in the lives of intersex people. These surgeries comes with risk, and it comes with complication, and it comes with lifelong traumas that intersex people have to deal with, and it has a great impact on their mental health, on their status in communities. We often find that intersex people isolate themselves, right? Because doctors are not honest to you about the variation, or oftentimes you feel like you are the only one, up until you find people like you. I think up until 22 years of age, I thought I was the only person born like this. I thought there was no one else in the entire universe like me, until I found people like me. And this oftentimes leads intersex people into isolation, because they don't have a sense of community and they don't feel like they belong anywhere. The second part, when it comes to your bodily autonomy, it's also the erasure of you being being an intersex person, because what doctors are trying to do is they're trying to fit these neat little boxes of sex binaries. Like, you know, in society we have this pink box, you're a girl, and we have the blue box, you a boy, and that is what doctors are trying to do. Like, the medical fraternity is like, let's put you in these boxes and we decide for you where you need to be. And because of this, it actually erases your entire identity of being an intersex person. Speaking from my context as someone that comes from Africa, we have much greater things that we deal with in Africa as well, and trigger warning, speaking about the infanticide of intersex children. So within certain societies, we don't have children, and I'm sure many First Nation people will understand that that's not born in hospitals, right, but that's born in rural settings with a traditional healer or traditional doctor. And we've had research done in certain provinces in Southern Africa where midwives has come forward and said that if an intersex child is born that has visible intersex traits, it's immediately noted that this is a bad omen, or this is witchcraft, or there is a curse on the family. And things that trigger warning that they would literally do is to take the child to a back of a room, snap the neck, and tell the mother that the child has died because of complications. And this is the lives and the realities of intersex people. Not only do we face challenges within medical settings, we face challenges within society. We are discriminated, and therefore we don't have access to education, we don't have access to employment. And it's so important that we're having this conversation when it comes to your body. The moment someone tries to strip you from your bodily autonomy and from your bodily integrity, it doesn't stop there, right? It doesn't stop there. It's such a perplexed situation, because the moment you are stripped of that, it's like you are stripping someone from their identity, and they have issues that comes after that. Thank you, Anne.
Oh, thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Crystal. It's just truly horrifying to think of those situations faced by intersex children. Turning now to Zhan and Julia, what are the differences between the challenges faced by intersex people when it comes to bodily autonomy and then trans and gender diverse people? Obviously, we're talking about two different population groups too, so it might be worth outlining that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Let me speak first about the differences between trans and intersex people, and then I'll leave it to Zhan to speak a little bit about the different challenges. And I'd like to make 3 points. The first one is, and Morgan has alluded to that already a little bit, so intersex, for most intersex persons, is not an identity, whereas being trans or gender non-conforming, gender non-binary, for most people, is an identity. So that's item number 1. So intersex usually, I mean, there are intersex people who would say, I have an intersex identity, but there's very, very few. Intersex people usually would say, well, intersex women, intersex men, men or women. And there are as well intersex people who are trans, but usually it's not an identity. For trans people, that is different. For most of us, it's an identity. What we have in common is that both of our populations are very, very heavily medicalized, in particular historically. The medicalization takes a little bit different shapes. For intersex persons, it's more rooted in the body, whereas for trans and gender non-conforming persons, it has been and continues to be considered something like a mental illness. However, both processes of medicalizations take away agencies from both intersex and trans persons, so we're considered as not fit to make decisions about our own, be it our bodies, our identities, and that is like the core problem of the medicalization and pathologization. It as well leads, as Chrysler said, to isolation and the feeling of being the only one. That has tremendously improved over the last, let's say, decade or two, in particular for trans persons. But I think for the intersex colleagues, we're definitely not there. So 15 years ago, if I would have said, well, I'm a trans woman, people would have stared bleak at me and had no idea what that meant about. And I think this is still the same for intersex persons. For trans persons, this has changed over the last 15 years, I would say. And then finally, both populations, both groups, suffer from vast misconceptions of who we are and what we are. And very often, trans and intersex people are conflated with each other, although our issues are, well, different.
I'll continue.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just hearing something. Thanks, Julia. Zhan, could you touch on some of the challenges then in relation to bodily autonomy specifically for trans people?
Yeah. So for the last year and a bit, I've been working in a regional organization focused on Europe and Central Asia. And before that, I was at ILGA World, looking at the whole world. And it's, what's really striking to me is that the challenges that are faced in one region is replicated across the globe. And it's the same, I think, here in Australia as well and in the Pacific region. But it's access to healthcare, that's well-funded and has a good understanding of what trans and gender diverse people actually need in terms of their trans-specific healthcare. And it's how healthcare also interlinks with legal gender recognition, which is often where a lot of the schisms start to appear. When it comes to legal gender recognition, there is still a gatekeeping and a marrying between the legal system and the medical system, such that the legal system relies on a medicalized model of what being trans is in order for people to access legal documents that reflect their gender identity. This is, in the Council of Europe, there's 23 countries in the Council of Europe that still have abusive requirements for people.
When you say abusive, can you step out what you mean?
So for that, I would say I'll separate out sterilization requirements, and I'll talk about anything which a person is coerced into changing aspects of their lives that they may not wish to. So to undergo a psychiatric determination, to undergo any kind of medicalized procedures, possibly forced divorce, possibly having some kind of, as an adult, some kind of third-party intervention to validate the fact that you are trans, such that you need to go through, and therefore go through a legal process. Challenges for children are still huge, right, in Europe and Central Asia, as they are across the world. And I think that that's also to do with a lot of misconceptions around what trans-specific healthcare is for children. I think when you mention, trans-specific healthcare, people think it's, it's something to do with hormones or surgery. And a lot of times it's just listening to the person or listening to the child and trying to understand what they want and what they need. And there's a real conflation of that. And it's something that the opposition has also hooked onto very, very smartly. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. But just to be clear, so when people want to have their ID documents reflect who they are, they face these requirements that are invasive, intrusive, and prevent them from gaining a birth certificate or other ID that makes them able to move through life to be treated with dignity and respect in their affirmed gender. Yeah. So that's what we're talking about here.
Yep.
And then ironically, there's an inability to access the healthcare they need, but yet this sometimes an unfair requirement for them to have gone through some kind of procedure in the first place.
Exactly, and it's a real inability to understand the concept of self-determination, basically, right? It's still a thinking that, in order to be trans, someone else needs to tell you that you are, right?
Yeah.
That's at the core of it.
I don't have to go to a doctor and say, hey, I'm a lesbian, But for a trans person, they're forced to explain themselves and have someone else verify who they are.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So the good news is in Australia we do have some jurisdictions that have moved forward and changed their laws, but one particular state, not to single out one, but I will, but New South Wales is the most behind, and we need to change our laws in New South Wales stat. Well, we know the threats, we know the challenges now, but there is a lot of good work happening to make sure that these challenges are progressed and dealt with. Let's talk a bit about the work you're all doing to move forward on this issue. Perhaps starting with you, Morgan.
Thank you, Anna. So I just like to say that I agree with both Julia and Zhan about some of the shared problems that we experience in both overlapping population groups and misconceptions and ignorance being kind of key. And just to comment very, very quickly on that, and sorry to not get to your question yet, Anna, but some of the ignorance and misconceptions, we hear people say, oh, surely these kinds of medical interventions don't happen anymore. Surely medicine has moved on. And they do still happen. And we're working on that to change that. Other misconceptions are, Crystal talked about, this notion of pink boxes and blue boxes, and if somebody doesn't fit, then we have to make them fit. And I just want to add to those comments and say that respect for our diversity as a population is not achieved through the creation of a third box. It's achieved by ensuring that people are able to express our own values and preferences as individuals about how we're treated. And in terms of the good work that's going on, I want to comment and say a couple of things about that. So firstly, the Australian Human Rights Commission has done some amazing work in this space. And in 2021, they published a major report of an inquiry on ensuring the health and human rights of people born with variations of sex characteristics. It makes concrete recommendations for reform in every jurisdiction in Australia. The recommendations fit with recommendations that UN treaty bodies and the UN system has been making to states on every continent. So the issues that are being addressed here are issues in Africa as well, in Asia, in Europe, in the Americas as well. And I just want to just comment as well that in terms of the good work, yesterday I chaired a panel in the afternoon with the Chief Minister of the ACT, Andrew Barr, and in that session, Chief Minister Andrew Barr said that the Australian Capital Territory government will introduce legislation to protect the rights of people born with variations in sex characteristics this month in the ACT Parliament. That comes on the back of years of work by his government. It's been difficult and complex because this area of law has been so neglected. And I'm really grateful for them doing this. And he didn't just make sure that the ACT invested in the work to make this happen. He issued a challenge to every other jurisdiction in Australia to do the same. And I want you to go back to wherever you live, whether it's New South Wales or Western Australia or any other state or territory, and say to your governments that they should be doing what the ACT is doing. And the ACT government is willing to work with those jurisdictions to make this happen.
Thanks, Morgan. We've got some promising signs in Victoria as well. We've got a commitment from the state of Victoria to effect law reform in this area soon, and congratulations to Intersex Human Rights Australia and all the activists in the country working on this important work. When you can't get the legislation passed, sometimes litigation is the answer, and Crystal knows this all too well. Crystal, tell us a bit about your work at the moment in the courts.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Anna. I think everything starts from this concealed method of care, right? So the moment how doctors cares for you as intersex people, it's all about let's conceal, let's hide all the stigma, let's not talk about it. And this obviously adds a lot of shame as intersex person. And that's why we find that we don't see a lot of intersex people that are out, right? Based on research, it says more than 1.7% of the population is intersex, meaning there's millions of intersex people. And also that research could be wrong, because in not all states we are counted, in not all states are there medical records that are available, so we don't know how many intersex people there are. But the problem is that as the medical fraternity, they believe that when they are doing these surgeries, it's like they are supporting you or helping you or ensuring that you live a better life as a person. But like I said, it does the complete opposite. So currently, if we're thinking about intersex people in Africa, even where our lives are criminalized, we have seen that some governments and some states have become more open to listen to intersex people because of the work that we've been doing about raising awareness and speaking about all the different variation of how someone is born intersex. It's a bit of a win-lose situation because you find that some states would say, oh, so you didn't have a choice, you were born like this. And they would say, oh, well, a trans person had a choice, which we know it's not a choice. And that's a bit of the problems that it's causing within our region, particularly when it comes to intersex issues. So the state is available to listen on intersex issues and listen on harmful medical practices or interventions, but then are still not open to listen to the transgender community or the lesbian community around sexual and reproductive health. So it causes this big situation, and we don't want to sit in a situation where some of us are winning and some is, you get what I'm saying? It's about all of us or none of us, because that we all need to win together, and that makes it really difficult. And that makes it really difficult. And in South Africa, I mean, we've been working really in the last few years. We even went to the place where we took our government on a state tour to Malta, where they had an opportunity to go look through the laws of self-determination and see how they can make South Africa a just society for intersex people. And we still have not had an answer to this. And we are at the point now as intersex people in South Africa where we have started the process of litigation, right? So we've started an open inquiry, we've done a public inquiry, and we are speaking with intersex communities, and we've been so fortunate that we had one of the lawyers that supported Casa Semenya that came forward to support the intersex community in South Africa pro bono, you know, to take on this litigation case. And I think it's very difficult because of the shame that's added to being intersex, right? People do not want to be out. People do not want to have their story out there. They don't want to go to court. You know, they don't want to speak in public about the intersex variation because people have told you your entire life that there's no one like you. You are the only one that exists in this type of body, and you should never talk about this. And what we are finding the challenge is with regards to litigation is actually having intersex people talk about their stories because they are not ready. I think it's been a few years where we've seen a lot of visible activists doing intersex work and, you know, that are out and that are proud, but it's still not easy because you still feel isolated in the community in itself, right? Sometimes you can come to spaces like these and no one understands what it is to be an intersex person, what the violations intersex people are facing, and the issues that intersex people deals with when it comes to health, legal gender recognition, and overall just social economic issues because of being intersex and having these experiences. So I think litigation is a good tool, but also I think society needs to be ready as well to be able to understand intersex people, right? I think for the longest time we've said, like, we don't need anybody to accept us. I mean, we are here, we exist, we don't care. But what we need is for people to listen to us and to listen to us with an open heart and an open mind and be able to unlearn and learn new things. Because for the, you know, people always say, as when intersex people speak, you are a voice for the voiceless. No, we all have voices. It's just our voices has been marginalized. People choose not to listen to us. So what I'm saying, listen to intersex people. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. So we've got education, awareness raising, law reform, listening, litigation, and acknowledging the cost that comes out for the individuals involved, which is why we all need to be allies for change. I would put in a plug for the campaign we're working on with Intersex Human Rights Australia. So if you do want to sign up and join Equality Australia and Intersex Human Rights Australia with our campaign for change, My Body, My Choice. Jump online and you can sign up and take action today to support the rights of intersex people in Australia. Had to get that one in. Turning now to Zhan, your work in the trans space is really drawn heavily on important research, and you've utilised that so effectively. Tell us a bit about your work.
Yeah, so at TGEU, at Transgender Europe, it's a regional organization and a membership organization. And I think something that is really apparent is that unless you put out a piece of research on something, you can talk till you're blue in the face and nobody actually really believes you. Or they believe you, but they're like, yes, but where's the research? So, part of the work that TGEU does is research and put stuff out to advance the issues that we're trying to work on. So at the end of last year, we recently published a self-determination research paper on legal gender recognition in Europe. And basically that was looking at addressing some of the myths around what happens when there is a self-determination model in a country, and the myths around fraudulent applications, or the stuff that people like to say, oh, but if you have a model that's so free and open, surely it's going to be abused by people who, for whatever reason, suddenly declare that they're trans, in order to commit some kind of crime, usually, right? So we put out a publication on that, which the colleague who worked on it is brilliant. I'm really, really happy with it. And yeah, we can chat about it, but it's also on the TGEU website. We have been working with ILGA Europe, which is a regional LGBTI organization, to put out a trans rights map every year, and that looks at different indicators of advances or regressions across a whole range of areas of rights. But what we did last year was to actually put out a trans health map in the EU. And this is really difficult. Those of you who work on health know, how do you score healthcare, right? But you have to start somewhere. So we had 6 indicators, a couple on children, a couple on access to different kinds of healthcare, and then the availability and accessibility of that healthcare. And we scored the EU countries on a scale. Malta came out the best, Ireland came out the worst, right? And Ireland was not expecting that, because Ireland has a self-determination model for legal gender recognition, but it's the access to healthcare that's failing. So, this was kind of a bit of a shock to the groups in Ireland, but at the end of the day, I think it's a useful advocacy tool for them.
Absolutely.
As well, right?
And we can also get those resources online on the conference platform as well. Thanks, Zhan. And Julia, now to you. You obviously work a lot at the UN. Tell us about how the UN is taking forward, but potentially offering some challenges to the movement for trans people to have their bodily autonomy recognised.
Yeah, with pleasure. And of course, ILGA World works a lot in the context of UN human rights mechanisms. Before I come to the challenges, let's look at the successes. And I have to say, if I had to name the 3 most controversial issues that exist in UN spaces, it would probably be challenges or questions to national sovereignty, sexual reproductive health and rights, in particular including abortion, as well as SOGI-esque issues. Those are by far the 3 most controversial themes that we have at the UN. And then there's a long gap, and then other issues come. So when it comes to sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, sex characteristics, I think I want to do a shout out to the colleagues who have been doing this for the last 20 years. Because what distinguishes the UN space to actually LGBTI communities as a whole is that in the UN context, sexual orientation and gender identity has always been negotiated at par with each other. It's been always gone together, whereas in the wider LGBTI movement, trans persons have been vastly excluded in our movement as intersex persons. I will as well say, probably realize that sex characteristics has not been at par with SOGI in the UN space, but that is as well a strategic choice. Why? Sexual orientation, gender identity are heavily criminalized in a number of UN member states, whereas intersex persons are not. So conflating the 2 issues, or putting them together, puts intersex persons actually in danger by being seen as part of SOGI-esque issues, and hence possibly being criminalized. So not having sex characteristics there together with sexual orientation, gender identity is a strategic choice. Sometimes we do that, but sometimes we don't. And I think that's an important thing. So when it comes to successes, I think what we have been able to build over the last decade or two is a strong body of evidence that the right to self-identification for transgender persons is a cornerstone of the international human rights system. There's a huge body of evidence. However, with the rise of anti-gender notions globally as well as nationally, we are at the moment at a pivotal moment where this gain has to be defended, both on national level, but as well in particular in the UN system. There've always been spaces in the UN where trans rights have been questioned. However, there's been, among human rights practitioners in the UN system, there's been a consensus that self-identification of trans people is core and key. However, that is being questioned at the moment. We are seeing for the first time that this approach is being watered down and questioned in the context of anti-gender movements. And here, as a movement, we have to put our foot down in defense of this core human right for trans persons.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And we know that Victor is doing a really good job of making sure that our issues are being prosecuted in a way that is consistent with our rights and dignity, obviously, but there are some worrying trends. Morgan, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I mean, Julia, I completely agree with Julia's comments. So, and I think you raised some really important issues. You know, the notion that the independent expert on sexual orientation, gender identity does not focus specifically on sex characteristics as well was a political choice made for geopolitical reasons and the impact in different regions of the world. But, you know, Victor's work does touch on intersex issues from time to time. It's not always comfortable, but then this is not a comfortable space, and I think we have to lean into that discomfort and find ways of lifting each other up. And there is work going on in parallel with the work that Victor is doing to work on sex characteristics issues within the UN system in ways that are appropriate to the needs of the population. So that there is work going on, and we are lifting each other up, I think. But the other thing that I think was really important that you said, Julia, was you identified some of the core areas of contention in the UN system. And it's not only SOGI and sex characteristics issues. You also identified sexual and reproductive health and the right to abortion. And I think it's crucial that we talk about this in this setting, in a session on bodily autonomy, because we all share a common interest in bodily autonomy. And we all share an interest in access to sexual and reproductive health services in ways that are appropriate to our needs and circumstances. And we want to ensure that people who need access to those services have access to abortion as well. And this is also under threat right now. We see what's happening in the US and elsewhere. And so whether we're talking about the intersex movement, work in the trans and gender diverse space, the LGBTI movement more generally, the women's movement, the disability movement, we all share a common interest in bodily autonomy and the right to make our own decisions about our own bodies to the maximum extent possible. In terms of the anti-gender movement, I just want to finally just say that if you're appearing on at an event with an anti-abortion speaker, then I think you should really consider whether you should be there or not.
I think that's a low bar. Juliet, thanks, Morgan. I think that's a really important point, and we'll hopefully have time to come back to it. And speaking of time, I don't have a timer, so if someone could give me a sense of how long I've got. Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up. But I do want to, I think, close by Julia, asking you to reflect a bit more on the anti-gender movement, because I think it's such a pressing issue facing our global movement, but particularly trans and gender diverse people. It's just escalating. It's increasingly well-resourced and coordinated. So I wanted you to talk a bit about the threat, but also the opportunities of working with the women's movement and the work you're doing there.
All right. Yeah, with pleasure, and I'll try to be brief. And I will say, yes, trans people have been in the focus of the anti-gender movement, but there's as well an effect on intersex persons that is very, very detrimental of the whole debate. And it's as well important to distinguish that the anti-gender movement is old. So there have been anti-gender movements and anti-gender actors for decades, questioning the right to abortion, questioning sexual reproductive health and rights, and now as well questioning the rights of trans persons. And it's important to distinguish between, the activists have been there for a long time, questioning gender equality as such, and now there's it's kind of a new branch emerging that is using narratives around that question the right to self-determination of trans persons as an anti-gender narrative. And what's important about that is to note that it's not only very detrimental to rights of all our communities, in particular trans as well as intersex persons, it's as well important to note that very often these notions and narratives are not really about trans or intersex or LGBTI people. It's very often a notion in order to harness conservative political power. So when we look at debates, for example, as we had them in the UK very recently, which all evolved around the legal gender recognition bill in Scotland or in the UK, which was supposed to be based on self-identification, those debates only on the surface are about trans people, but in fact they are there in order for conservative and very right-wing political parties and politicians to gain their support and bring their voters to the ballot box. And we've been seeing this in the UK, we see this in Hungary, and we see this in Latin America, and in many, many other world regions. And I'm stressing this to this extent because if we keep pushing back only on the trans front, we're missing out, and we're missing out this whole other dimension we will be pushing against on the losing end. And that brings me back to, we need to foster kind of a holistic pushback approach, and that means building alliances with the women's movement, with the movement on sexual reproductive health and rights, which is a queer issue, as Morgan has said, in the first place, in order for us to stand together and defend our rights together with feminist and women's rights, because we're basically being attacked on the similar grounds. And all our rights are in question, and we as a movement can't only think about, our own little box, but need to stand together in solidarity with everyone else. And I think on the global level...
Thanks, Julia. We are at time, but I'm going to give each, apart from Julia, every other, because that was a very strong call to action to us all. Crystal, Morgan, Zhan, an opportunity for one closing remark, preferably a sentence, perhaps two. What do you want to leave the audience with today? Whether it's a personal story, a positive reflection on how far we're travelling, how far we're got to go, or a call to action. Crystal?
Yeah, I think I just want to leave by quoting Heike. Heike is an inspiration to all of us as intersex people, and Heike is like all our personal hero. When we found intersex, we found Heike. And yesterday Heike said intersex people are everywhere. So I just want to say that we exist, and intersex rights are human rights. Thank you.
Morgan?
We are everywhere, and our rights matter. We are looking for the same rights that other people are seeking. The right to make our own decisions about who we are, how we want to live in the world, how we want to be treated. And you can do a lot to support us. You can turn up, you can get engaged with your governments, you can support and improve the work in the ACT. Please do think about how you can support the petition and how you can engage with policymakers to make that happen. And thank you.
Thanks, Morgan.
Can I add one thing?
I just want to add one thing. Is the mic on? So yesterday we spoke about funding, and someone spoke about the LGBTQIA+ movement gets 50% out of every $100. But just know, out of that 50 cents, Intersex and also LBQ organizing gets about 1% of that. So that means there's little to no funding for Intersex and LBQ movements. So also lastly, give us the money. Thank you.
No pressure, Zhan, you're last up.
No, Crystal read my mind. I've been thinking about money a lot in the last few months. But you know, coming back to Australia, and it makes me really sad that I see a lot of the work is still voluntarily done for the LGBTI movements. You know, like there is money out there and we're not accessing it. I mean, if you're interested, you know, the Global Philanthropy Project has really good resources on mapping where the money is going for LGBTI funding. There's the State of Trans and Intersex funding reports, which are really good as well. But trans and intersex groups are not getting money. Trans groups are better, and intersex groups really, really are not getting money, but both communities are not getting money. And we really just need, you know, donors and of all kinds to actually see the specific issues and see the worth of funding the work that we're doing, because
led by communities.
Led by communities, because people are, you know, getting old and burning out and just not thinking ahead, and that makes me sad. So I would like to see the money come in, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Zhan. Thank you to all of our panelists. I'll hand you back over to Fran. Please give them a round of applause.